You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
There is a story the world never fully heard. Not because it was hidden exactly, but because it was buried beneath decades of nostalgia, beneath the mythology of four boys from Liverpool who changed music forever. We celebrate the Beatles as a brotherhood, for lads bound by genius, ambition, and the kind of chemistry that only comes along once in a generation. But brotherhood is complicated. And George Harrison knew that better than anyone. George was the youngest, the most spiritual, the one who seemed to float above the noise of fame and ego and record contracts. He was the quiet Beatle, they said, as if silence were the same thing as peace. It wasn't. Beneath that calm exterior lived a man who spent years feeling dismissed, undervalued, and creatively suffocated. A man who watched his songs get pushed to the margins while others took center stage. A man who, for all his talk of love and transcendence, carried a wound that never completely closed. So today, we are going to talk about something that Beatles historians have danced around for years. We are going to talk about the relationship that defined George Harrison's inner life more than any other. Not his marriages, not his spiritual journey, not even his solo career. We are going to talk about the person George Harrison truly despised more than anyone else in his world. And the answer, when you look honestly at the evidence, might not be who you expect. To understand George Harrison's resentments, you have to understand where he came from and what he was made of. He was born on February 25, 1943, in a modest terraced house on Arnold Grove in Wavertree, Liverpool. The youngest of four children, George grew up in a working-class household where money was tight and ambition had to be earned through grit. His father, Harold, drove buses. His mother, Louise, was warm, encouraging, and deeply musical, a woman who filled her home with sound and supported her youngest child's passion for the guitar with the kind of quiet faith that shapes a person for life. Louise Harrison was no ordinary mother. She had a voice that could rattle the windows and a spirit that welcomed the strange and the beautiful. During her pregnancy with George, she tuned into Radio India broadcasts, captivated by the drone of sitars and the rhythm of tablas. Whether or not that prenatal exposure truly shaped George's later obsession with Indian music is impossible to say with certainty, but the symbolism is difficult to ignore. He came into the world already reaching towards something mystical, something beyond the ordinary. When Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel crackled out of a neighbor's window while George rode his bicycle through the streets of Liverpool in early 1956, everything changed. He was 13 years old. He became consumed, not just by rock and roll, but by the guitar itself. He sketched guitars in his schoolbooks. He talked about guitars constantly. He badgered his mother until she spent £3.10, money the family could barely spare, to buy him a second-hand instrument. From that point forward, the guitar was not just a hobby. It was a calling. He was not a natural in the conventional sense. He had to work for everything he achieved as a musician. While Lennon and McCartney seemed to generate songs effortlessly, Harrison practiced obsessively, learning chord shapes late into the night, copying solos note by note until his fingers ached. That work ethic never left him. And neither did the feeling that his effort was never quite appreciated enough by the people who mattered most. George met Paul McCartney on a bus to school. They were teenagers bonding over music, and Paul was struck by this younger kid who already played with a seriousness beyond his years. It was Paul who vouched for George when John Lennon's skiffle group, the Quarrymen, were looking for a lead guitarist. John was skeptical. George was too young, too slight, too quiet. But George played raunchy note perfect on a Liverpool bus and John was convinced. He was in. From the beginning, the hierarchy was clear. John and Paul were the creative center. George was the lead guitarist, talented, essential, but secondary. In the early years, nobody questioned this arrangement much. George was 15 when he joined the Quarrymen. He was learning, growing, absorbing. He did not yet have the songwriting ambitions that would eventually drive him to frustration. But even in those early years, the seeds of resentment were being planted. The Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership was forged quickly and protected fiercely. It was a closed circle. George stood just outside it, contributing his guitar genius but rarely invited to contribute his ideas on a deeper creative level. He wrote songs. Good songs. But they were treated, from the start, as lesser, as filler between the real material. By the time the Beatles became the most famous band on earth, George had grown considerably as a songwriter. But the structure of the band had already calcified. Lennon and McCartney wrote. George played. That was the deal, whether anyone said it out loud or not. The frustration that built inside George Harrison during the Beatles' years was not a single dramatic moment. It was a slow accumulation, 1,000 small dismissals adding up to something that never fully went away. Each Beatles album allowed Harrison only 2 or 3 original compositions, regardless of how strong his material was. He was sitting on a library of songs, melodies and lyrics that were, by any objective measure, extraordinary, and he was being rationed like a junior writer who had not yet earned his place at the table. He had more than earned his place. He had been there from nearly the beginning. But the hierarchy did not update itself to reflect reality. His compositions on Revolver in 1966, Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You, showed a songwriter firing on all cylinders, capable of biting political commentary, sonic experimentation, and emotional depth all at once. Taxman opened the album. It did not open George's bandmates' eyes. He was still given the same limited allocation of tracks. The message was clear, even if no one was cruel enough to say it directly. Your songs are good, George. Just not as important as ours. When Abbey Road came together in 1969, something shifted. Harrison came in with Something and Here Comes the Sun, 2 songs of such undeniable quality that even his most dismissive colleagues had to acknowledge them. Frank Sinatra would later call Something the greatest love song written in 50 years. John Lennon called it the best song on the album. The world agreed. But by the time Harrison finally received that recognition, the Beatles were already falling apart. The acknowledgement came too late to heal what had broken. Now we come to the heart of this story. Because when you trace the thread of George Harrison's resentment, when you follow it back through the studio arguments, the creative slights, the spiritual mockery, the dismissive silences, you do not end up where most people assume you will. Most casual Beatles fans would guess that George's deepest animosity was directed at Paul McCartney. Paul was domineering in the studio, controlling, relentlessly perfectionist, and undeniably condescending toward Harrison's abilities for much of their career together. Harrison himself said that Paul could be overpowering, that he would spend sessions cheerfully helping with Paul's songs and then receive only grudging attention when the time came to work on his own material. He called Paul's behavior selfish. He said, in a 1974 interview, that he would rather play with almost any other musician than work alongside McCartney, purely on musical grounds. But Paul McCartney, for all his flaws, for all the frustrations he caused, genuinely loved George. He called him his baby brother. He sat beside him in his final days, held his hand, and wept. He delivered tributes after George's death in 2001 that were not the words of someone who had been an enemy. They were the words of a man grieving someone he had known and loved since they were both teenagers on a school bus. The relationship with Paul was complex, painful, and ultimately rooted in real affection. Even George acknowledged that. In 2001, when asked about McCartney, Harrison responded with a Victorian proverb about accepting a friend's faults. That is not the language of hatred. That is the language of hard-won understanding. No, the relationship that George Harrison never fully made peace with, the one that left the deepest and most unresolved wound, was his relationship with John Lennon. John Lennon was George Harrison's hero before he was his bandmate. George idolized John. He wanted John's approval more than he wanted almost anything else in his early life. When you understand that, you understand why what followed hurt so profoundly. John Lennon was brilliant, magnetic, and deeply cruel in ways that were often disguised as honesty or humor. He had a gift for locating the most sensitive point in a person and pressing on it, not always maliciously, but with a casualness that was almost worse than deliberate cruelty. With George, that sensitive point was his spiritual life and his creative ambitions. As George deepened his involvement with Indian music and Hindu philosophy throughout the mid-1960s, John was initially curious but quickly became dismissive. He had his own spiritual wandering to do, transcendental meditation, primal scream therapy, political activism, and he had little patience for paths other than his own. He mocked George's devotion to the Hare Krishna movement. He belittled his interest in the sitar and Indian classical music, sometimes in front of others. He treated George's spiritual journey as a phase, a quirk, something slightly embarrassing. For a man whose entire identity, whose entire sense of purpose, had become bound up in that spiritual practice, to be mocked by the person whose opinion mattered most was not a minor thing. It was a betrayal. Professionally, Lennon was no kinder. He took George's songwriting contributions no more seriously than McCartney did, perhaps less so, because at least Paul occasionally acknowledged George's talent, even if it was condescending. John simply did not engage. He was not interested in helping George develop his songs. He was not interested in giving George's ideas the kind of collaborative attention he expected for his own work. During the chaotic Let It Be sessions in January 1969, captured on film for the world to eventually see, the dynamics were laid bare. George quit the band. He walked out. He had reached a limit that years of quiet endurance had finally exhausted. When asked on camera what would happen if he left, John's response was flippant. They would get another guitarist, he said. It was a joke, perhaps. Or perhaps it was not entirely a joke. Either way, George did not find it funny. In 1980, George Harrison published his memoir, I, Me, Mine. It is one of the most unusual autobiographies ever written by a rock star, part lyrics collection, part personal reflection, part spiritual testimony. And it contains one of the most damning silences in music history. John Lennon is barely in it. For a book about a man who spent more than a decade as John Lennon's bandmate, collaborator, and one-time hero, the near-total absence of Lennon is extraordinary. Other figures appear throughout: musicians, friends, spiritual teachers. Paul is there. Ringo is there. But Lennon is a ghost. Harrison makes a few oblique references to the band, but treats Lennon as almost peripheral to his own life story. When the book was published, Lennon was still alive, and he was furious. He told the press that he felt erased, that Harrison had written him out of his own history. He described the memoir as ungrateful and historically dishonest. The irony, of course, is that Lennon, who spent years treating George as a peripheral figure, was now outraged at being treated as one himself. John Lennon was shot and killed in New York City on December 8, 1980. George mourned publicly. He wrote and recorded all those years ago as a tribute, reuniting with Paul and Ringo for the recording. He said the right things. He honored the memory of his bandmate in public and in song. But in private, those who knew George well noted that his grief was complicated. He did not pretend to feel things he did not feel. He had loved John once, deeply and completely. And John had taken that devotion and returned it with mockery, dismissal, and indifference. By the time John died, George and he had not been close for years. The loss was real. The wound underneath it was just as real. Harrison was not a man who expressed his resentments loudly. He was not built for public feuds. But in interviews over the years, he was honest in ways that required careful listening to fully understand.